In this video, I'm identifying 8 underrated wines that I'm buying now, and I'm also going to be identifying some of my favorite producers of those wines. Located in the southern Rhone region of France, only about 10 miles away from Châteauneuf-du-Pape, Gigondas is often overshadowed by that legendary AOC. And yet, there are some excellent wines coming out of Gigondas and at prices that are meaningfully lower than Châteauneuf wines. Like Châteauneuf-du-Pape, Gigondas wines are oftentimes a blend of Grenache, Syrah, and Mourvèdre, so-called GSM blends. Under the AOC requirements, Gigondas has to include at least 50% Grenache and at least one of Syrah or Mourvèdre, although as a practical matter it oftentimes includes all three. If you're drinking a Gigondas, at least currently, you know you're drinking a red wine, as at least to date there are no white wines that bear the Gigondas AOC designation. That will soon change, however, as back in September of 2022, the Gigondas AOC voted to amend its specifications to include white wines. That change will become effective with the 2023 vintage. The fact that the Gigondas AOC is largely located in the foothills of mountains is beneficial for at least two reasons. First, the mountains provide some beneficial and welcome shade to vineyards located in certain areas. And second, due to the fact that some vineyards are planted at elevations up to 600 meters above sea level, those vineyards planted at the higher elevations often benefit from a higher diurnal range and cooler nighttime temperatures. That results in grapes that have higher acidity levels and which ultimately results in wines with higher acidity as well. Nevertheless, Gigondas does have a hot, dry Mediterranean climate that produces bold, red, concentrated wines with relatively high alcohol by volume. In my experience, Gigondas wines oftentimes benefit from several additional years of bottle aging and show their best anywhere from 3 to 10 years after the vintage on the label. While there's a number of outstanding wineries producing high-quality Gigondas, I'm going to briefly mention two of my favorites in this video. The first is Château Saint-Côme. Château Saint-Côme is a historic producer that's located in Gigondas. Saint-Côme has about 15 hectares of vineyards that they use to make estate wines, but they also act as a negociant and source fruit as well. You really can't go wrong with anything from this producer, and I'm pretty much a fan across the board. Another Gigondas producer we're seeking out is Domaine Brousset. Domaine Brousset does not source any fruit, rather they make wine solely from estate-grown fruit. While Domaine Brousset does make wine from a number of southern Rhone appellations that are worth trying, I'm particularly fond of their Gigondas. One of these wines in particular offers extraordinary quality for the price. This wine received a 96-point score from Jeb Dunnock, yet sells for only about $40, so pretty impressive indeed. I recently attended a large Italian wine event where I had the opportunity to taste dozens of Italian wines. While many were impressive, there was one particular region that kept standing out, and that was probably the biggest revelation from that tasting. And so the next underrated wine that I'm buying now is Montepolciano Debruso. And before we go any further, it's important that you don't get confused between Montepolciano, the grape that's used to make Montepolciano Debruso, and Montepolciano, the Tuscan village in which winemakers produce Vino Nobile di Montepolciano, which is a Sangiovese dominant blend. While Montepolciano has long been recognized as a workhorse grape that's used to produce large quantities of inexpensive wine from central Italy, it's also capable of making very high-quality wine. One scandalous example of that is that a few years ago, many well-known producers of Brunello di Montalcino were investigated for improperly including Montepolciano in their Brunello di Montalcino, which of course must be 100% Sangiovese. But they wouldn't have been able to do that and do that for as long as they had allegedly done so unless the Montepolciano was capable of producing high-quality wine. Montepolciano Debruso is a large region that's located between the Apennine foothills and the Adriatic Sea. The Apennine foothills provide some rocky soils and some elevation and cooling influences, and this is where many of the best wines from Montepolciano Debruso are produced. Montepolciano Debruso can be a bold, tannic red wine that has substantial structure. According to the applicable requirements, These wines have to be made from at least 85% Montepolciano. One of the very best producers in Montepolciano Debruso is Valentini. Valentini definitely makes some of the most coveted wines for collectors from Montepolciano Debruso, and these wines all sell for super premium prices. Another great choice is the top wine from a producer named Pisetti, which I enjoyed last week, namely the 2015 Pisetti Harriman Montepolciano Debruso Reserva. This is an outstanding wine that's made from a small 2-hectare vineyard that's around 550 meters above sea level, and which has 80-year-old vines that produce extremely low yields. The result is an impressive, complex wine that's concentrated and intense, but which has some impressive freshness from the cooling influences that are experienced at this vineyard due to the Apennine Mountain influence. Another one of my favorite wines from the Italian tasting last week was the 2017 Capolavigna Montepolciano Debruso, which is from Famiglia di Carlo. This was an extremely polished wine that had excellent tannin management and which was very well balanced. Despite its youth, it was already very approachable and extremely enjoyable. This wine was one of 9 that was included in a comparison tasting during my masterclass, and it was easily my favorite of that lineup. The next underrated wine that I'm buying now is also from Abruzzo, but this time I'm talking about a white wine that's made from the Pecorino grape. If you're not familiar with Pecorino, it's a grape that's naturally high in acidity, and flavors and aromas tend to include lemon, apple, sage, and thyme. There's 2 different styles of Pecorino that are being made today. One is a fruit-forward wine that undergoes minimal aging and is released quickly to emphasize the primary fruit. But there's also a style where they tend to age the wines in neutral oak for about 12 to 18 months. This neutral oak aging adds some complexity and some texture to some of the Pecorino that utilize that method. This is going to result in some subtle influence, much like you would find with Bordeaux Blanc, when they utilize some neutral French oak to age their Sauvignon Blanc and their Semillon blends. Of the Pecorino wines that I tasted last week, my general preference was for those that had the additional neutral oak aging, as they seem to have a little bit more complexity, and I did appreciate the texture that came from the oak. My favorite Pecorino was the Pisetti Collecchivetta Abruzzo Pecorino. This impressive wine comes from the Pisetti's best Pecorino fruit. This is one of the wines that undergoes the additional neutral oak aging. As recently as 1980, in Germany, only 10% of the grapes that were planted for wine were black grapes that were used to produce red wine. As recently as a few years ago, that had increased dramatically, and now almost 40% of the grapes planted in Germany are black grapes to produce red wine. Of these, Pinot Noir is the most dominant black grape, with about 11.5% of plantings overall. And so the next underrated wine that I'm buying now is Spätburgunder, or German Pinot Noir. Spätburgunder does very well in some of the warmer areas in Germany, which include Baden and Pfalz. Both of these regions are warmer as they're basically opposite Alsace, and which benefit from the protection of the mountains. Baden, for example, is on the east side of the Rhine, and it's located in a rain shadow. Of course, Baden is also located to the south, and so it's warmer for that reason as well. But there is an area in northern Germany that does very well with Spätburgunder, and this is a very small region that's called Ahr. So you definitely want to keep an eye out for Spätburgunder from Ahr as well. While it's difficult to generalize, and there's always exceptions, when compared to Burgundy, German Pinot Noir often has a little bit more acidity, a little bit less tannin, and a little bit more red fruit up front. Some of the top examples of Spätburgunder are difficult to locate even in Germany, and I'm just getting started tasting through some Spätburgunder myself, but a couple of the names that I've enjoyed so far include the Meyer-Neckel Pinot Noir. This one comes from Ahr. It's aged for about 10 months in neutral oak, and the grapes for this wine come from the Devonian slate soils that are in the Ahr Valley. This one sells for about $40 and is readily available in the United States. Another Spätburgunder that I enjoyed comes from Wittmann. This is the Wittmann Spätburgunder Trocken, which comes from the Rheinhessen and sells for around $30 a bottle. This is an impressive wine that's produced from biodynamically grown fruit. On this wine, I particularly enjoyed the intriguing aromatics, and the finish was surprisingly long as well. If you're interested in wine recommendations, wine collecting strategies, and learning more about wine, please do subscribe to my channel. I've been collecting wine for more than 15 years and also have a level 4 diploma from the WSET. So I have both formal certification as well as substantial practical knowledge from the School of Hard Knocks. While Pinot Noir gets most of the attention when it comes to Willamette Valley, Oregon, the Chardonnay is outstanding as well. The Eola Amity Hills AVA in particular is a terrific place for world-class Chardonnay. This is so at least partly due to the fact that the Van Duzer corridor funnels cool coastal breezes through the Eola Amity Hills AVA during what would otherwise be the hottest part of the day during the warm summer months. This helps result in a growing season that is extended, and it also helps to preserve acidity and freshness in the Chardonnay fruit, which is particularly important because Chardonnay prefers cool climates. I experienced these winds for myself one time in August when I was tasting at the Seven Springs Vineyard that belongs to Evening Land in the Eola Amity Hills. It was after lunch, and I was tasting outside on a table, and there were wine glasses that were lined up, and right around 2 or 2:30 or so, the winds picked up, and there were very strong breezes that were blowing through the vineyard, and they ended up even knocking over and breaking a couple of the wine glasses that were sitting on the edge of the table. So this is definitely a huge influence, and it makes a big difference to the fruit. I've been going to Willamette Valley to taste wine probably once a year for the past 4 or 5 years, and the Chardonnays have been consistently impressive throughout that time period. So Willamette Valley Chardonnay is the next underrated wine that I'm buying right now. Well, there's lots of affordable, excellent examples of Willamette Valley Chardonnay. One of my favorites is the Domaine Druhan Rose Rock Chardonnay. This impressive Chardonnay comes from the Eola Amity Hills. The 2020 vintage of this wine received an impressive 94 points, and yet sells for only around $38 a bottle. So this is definitely one to keep an eye out for. There's also a smaller producer named Lingua Franca that's extremely impressive. These Chardonnays tend to be a little bit more expensive, but they're also world-class. The next underrated wine that I'm buying now is Willamette Valley Pinot Noir. Willamette Valley Pinot Noir tends to be a bit of a middle ground between Sonoma Pinot Noir and Burgundy Pinot Noir. It has a little bit more earthiness and elegance than some of the Sonoma Pinot Noir, and it has a little bit more ripe fruit than Burgundy, for example. One of the historic problems with Willamette Valley Pinot Noir is that there was substantial vintage variation, and they often had years with abysmal weather. However, that's changed somewhat with more consistently warm summers, and because many of the producers have gotten better used to dealing with off vintages. And so now if they do get bad weather, they know how to handle it better and to minimize the adverse impacts from that weather. One of my favorite producers of Willamette Valley Pinot Noir is Violin. Violin is run by an owner winemaker named Will Hamilton. Will does a pretty good job, and he has some affordable Appalachian Pinot Noir that sells for as little as $30 a bottle, and which I buy quite a bit of each year. He also does a really good job with some of the single vineyard wines that he has, such as Sojo, which is another one of my favorites. In addition to Violin Willamette Valley Pinot Noir, I'm also buying the Soter Pinot Noir from Willamette Valley. Tony Soter has been an outstanding winemaker for decades. Tony Soter started out making wines for Etude in California, including some outstanding Napa Valley Cabernet in the 1990s. But he then moved to Willamette Valley and has been doing an exceptional job with Willamette Valley Pinot Noir for a couple decades. When it comes to Willamette Valley Pinot Noir, there is one important caveat, however, and that's to be extremely careful with the 2020 vintage. Personally, I'm just skipping that vintage since I stocked up on some of the earlier vintages, and because the 2021 vintage is already being released onto store shelves now. But due to the smoke taint associated with some of the 2020s, I'm just personally thinking that it's safer to skip that one and go straight to 2021. The next underrated wine that I'm buying now is Terrazzi. Terrazzi comes from the Campania region in Italy, and it's located near Irpinia. This is another region that benefits from the elevation and moderating influences of the Apennine foothills. Terrazzi is made from the Aglianico grape. Aglianico is a very high-quality grape that's capable of making age-worthy complex wines. Aglianico tends to be high in acid and high in tannins. The best examples tend to come from the Apennine foothills at elevations around 200 to 600 meters above sea level. At these elevations, the vineyards receive some cooling influences that helps to extend the growing season. In terms of producers of Terrazzi to keep an eye out for, I would definitely try some of the Faudi di San Gregorio wines. They have a Reserva that I enjoy very much, but they also have a special wine that's called Serpico. Serpico is made from some extraordinarily old pre-phylloxera vines that are well over 100 years old and have extraordinarily low yields. So if you can find Serpico, I highly recommend it. And Donna Chiara makes an expression that's a little bit more approachable when it's younger, and which also has a more friendly price point than many of the Terrazzi that are on the market. The next underrated wine that I'm buying right now also comes from Campania. This time it's a white wine, and it's called Graco de Tufo. This is a high-acid white wine that's made from the Graco grape. Graco de Tufo tends to be deep lemon in color with a bit of an oily texture, and flavors and aromas include stone fruit, a bit of a smokiness, and oftentimes some floral characteristics as well. I appreciate it because it has extremely high acidity. It tends to be unoaked. The best expressions are capable of aging in the cellar for a number of years. In general, the quality level is quite good across the board, and there are some particularly outstanding examples. One of my favorites is the Faudi di San Gregorio Graco de Tufo. This wine can typically be purchased for around $25 to $30 or so. It's oftentimes an extremely good buy at restaurants, both because it's food-friendly from the high acidity and because it's budget-friendly. I will typically order a Graco de Tufo at an Italian restaurant right when I arrive and while I'm waiting for my red wine to aerate and decant so that it's ready by the time that I get to the main course.